Totally possible. I'd be open to it. Quotes James Gunn when asked about the possibility of a DC themed hero shooter like Marvel Rivals. And you know what? I don't think it's going to happen. I'll be perfectly honest. I don't think it's really going to happen. But you know what? It's fun to think about. And if they do make a hero shooter, I think this is a way they could do it if it's truly inspired by Marvel Rivals. So I came up with a general story that DC could use. I came up with a few ideas of maps and what type of map would it be, like a convoy or convergence map, because let's be honest, convergence is really just another form of convoy, or domination map, and what sub areas would be for each general map. And then what I'm sure most of you have clicked on this video asking or trying to think about is, what would the roster be and what roles would each of those characters have? But I took it one step further. I at least try to come up with an idea for each character's ultimate. Without any further ado, thank you to all my fellow and distinguished nerds, and let's go ahead and think about what story could this game have. So an idea for the story is, when the Anti-Monitor gains control of the Mobius share, he looks to have total control over the entire DC multiverse, dropping various heroes and villains from across the timeline and multiverse into various arenas for his own entertainment. And this is, of course, where us as playable characters would come into play. However, being aware of the puppets on strings, Dr. Manhattan interferes with the Anti-Monitor's plan, causing rifts and fractures in the multiverse and timeline, furthering the story. Next up, maps. So I came up with 4 ideas for convoy and convergence maps specifically, and 4 ideas for domination maps, with each of those 4 getting 3 potential sub areas. So starting with the convoy convergence maps, I think in no particular order, I think there'd be Kahndaq, the Fortress of Solitude, the planet Krypton, and the planet Oa. I mean, think about it. You're, say, carrying a payload to the Rock of Eternity. Maybe you're carrying a payload across the Fortress of Solitude from, say, the entrance all the way, like, deep inside the fortress. You know, you're traveling on Krypton, like, past the Council of Krypton. Like, that'd be really, really cool. Or on Oa, your payload is taken to the central battery. When it comes to domination maps, I mean, let's not overthink it. Gotham will appear somehow, somewhere in this game, like how New York was destined to be in Rivals. Honestly, kind of surprised we didn't start out in season 0 with a New York game, or a New York map, excuse me. But in Gotham, I think 3 great areas would be just a general downtown Gotham area, maybe outside GCPD. Then you'd have a Batcave-centered area, and then an Arkham Asylum. Next up, the planet Apocalypse. Imagine trying to take over Darkseid's throne, the orphanage, and the main hall. Next up, if you're gonna have Gotham, you're gonna have Metropolis. So let's do Star Labs, the Daily Planet, and another general downtown area. Finally, Belle Reve, the prison where the Suicide Squad is from. You'd have a general outdoor yard area, a cell block, and the office/command center, which would be massive for this. I did come up with 4 other cool ideas for maps, but I didn't give them any, game mode role. I don't have a convoy, convergence, or domination for any of these 4, but what do you think these 4 would work as? I got Gorilla City, Themyscira, Atlantis, and Central City. And now it is time for the heroes. And I technically have a lineup of 36 heroes, which, depending on which way you look at it, 36 or it's closer to 40, it'll make more sense as we go along. That's a few more than Marvel Rivals had at launch. Marvel Rivals had specifically 33 heroes at launch. I aimed for about 18 supports and tanks, 9 apiece, and about 18 DPS. Let's go ahead and just jump into this, though. With the tanks first, obviously, Superman. I think Superman, he's got to be a tank. The big thing about him is that he's bulletproof. So if you want to feel like you're bulletproof, you have to be able to take hits. Generally, he'll be mostly melee. He'll have a passive fly ability. Maybe if you double tap spacebar or something like that, he'll have like an unlimited fly ability or something. His ultimate is, think of like Cloak and Dagger. Dash, pause, what have you, right? Let's say you pick up 1 enemy per dash, and you hold on to that enemy for the rest of your ults. And then you dash into another enemy and you pick them up. And you repeat this depending on how successful you are for each grab. and it's more and more damage. And if you throw him into a wall, that's even more damage. Moving on into Wonder Woman, I think generally she should play kind of similar to Captain America. She'd have her shield and her sword for blocking and damage. She'd have her lasso for kind of similar to Strange's whip, maybe some extra CC from her. But her ultimate, don't overthink it. The Bracer Clash, it's gotta be the Bracer Clash. Just dealing a lot of immediate damage and maybe even blinding to anybody within 360 degrees up to a certain range of Wonder Woman. Next up is where the roster size comes a bit iffy, and it's not exact. This would be a combo character, if you will. It's not just a reskin, but Shazam and or Black Adam. These two characters have identical powers. I mean, unless you go extremely niche into specific comics, I'm talking specific issues of comics, you might find that Black Adam has some ability that Shazam doesn't, or what have you. But generally speaking, these characters have the same powers with the exact same origin. They're just different people. To me, an original idea I had is you would put your cursor over their icon, you'd click it, and then it'd expand out into two more icons, and you can either choose Shazam or Black Adam, and the game would register that one of the two was chosen. Nobody else on your entire team would be able to play as Black Adam or Shazam, despite no matter which one you chose. I also was thinking that, well, it'd be kind of fun for the sake of team compositions if you could use both Shazam and Black Adam at the cost of a, different role on your team or a different set of powers. You would double down on these abilities. So you could do maybe a similar thing between Superman and Supergirl, or Superman and Zod. And so I'll leave it up to you in which way you'd like to see how that work. Let's just kind of move into the movesets of Black Adam and Shazam. So similar to Hulk and Banner, they would start out as their kid form, or their non-hero form, if you will, and then of course yelling Shazam, lightning bolt, boom, they're in their hero form. And that's going to be their main form. And then their battling will be similar to Thor and Storm, using all their lightning abilities. Now, when it comes to their ults, like how Hulk can, puny God somebody and whip them around, you would also grab a singular target, raise them over your chest, yell Shazam, big lightning bolt comes down on the one target, it's a big FU to that guy, and then deals some solid splash damage to any nearby enemies around you. Next up, Cyborg. I'll admit, Cyborg is the most creative, or one of the more creative ideas for an ultimate that I came up with. And that is, it's either going to be super overpowered or super underpowered, and I don't know which one. It will affect players' HUDs, the heads-up displays. Players are now blinded with a glitch effect. All their cooldowns and timers are going haywire, and enemies are taking more damage during this time as well. So basically, you can't see what's going on. You don't know if your abilities are actually working. You can't really hear or see anything, and you take more damage in the meantime. So it's kind of like Doctor Strange's ultimate, where you're just kind of like in your astral form for a few seconds. Mix that with a blind and the fact that you have no idea what the hell is going on, you genuinely have no idea. Next up, Lex Luthor. I think generally he'll play similarly to Penny Parker and The Thing, where he's going to be kind of like a brawler while in his mech suit, and his ultimate would be similar to Penny, where he can rush the enemy with some overshield and really screw some people up. He'd also have some ranged abilities with shoulder guns or something like that, similar to Penny. Next up, a more creative character for the Vanguard or tank role, Big Barda. Big Barda is going to be probably like the 1-star of 1-star heroes in terms of difficulty. She's going to be super simple. She's going to be a melee brawler that will have a little bit of range if you extend out her, what's called her Mega Rod. She would maybe have some ability that could enable dodging for a few seconds, so it could help mitigate some damage. And her ult will be like Magic's in that it just gives a general power boost for a couple of seconds, so all her attacks hit a little harder. She might take a little bit less damage or have a little bit more health, one or the other there, and maybe move a little bit faster. She's just going to become a bit more powerful for a while. Next up, Swamp Thing. I'll admit, very similar to Groot. I try to be really creative in how he is different than Groot, however. Where Groot, of course, can put down these walls, some walls could deal damage, and some gives overshield. What if instead you have vines that can cover the ground or pre-existing walls? Maybe instead of damaging them, they just cause a lot of slow. Maybe also he can create maybe like vine turrets as well that come out of pre-existing walls or what have you. Like if you're going around a corner, you can't like create a wall like Groot, but you can cover a wall with some turrets. For his ults, instead of Groot, where Groot can like pull a lot of enemies close together, he can have a lot of vines, grab enemies and pull them apart. So it's easier to take one enemy at a time. So it's great in combo with communication with your team. It's like, all right, Swamp Thing ulting, and then all the heroes then jump one character at a time because now all the characters are far away from one another. It's harder to heal, it's harder to deal damage, it's harder to stay coordinated when everybody's separated. Next up, the Demon Etrigan. Now, not a lot of info here on Etrigan. He'd generally be a mystical tank, similar to like Doctor Strange in a lot of ways. Number one, he has to be rhyming a lot in his dialogue, especially before he goes for his ultimate, which his ultimate, I'll admit, is pretty creative for what I've come up with for these characters. So I always thought of like numbers game. It's 6v6, you take out one enemy, now it's 6v5. But what if during that like 10-second respawn timer for the fallen enemy, for part of that 10 seconds, they would fight alongside you, where you get a spirit of your downed opponent fighting alongside you for 5 to 10 seconds. And then you can take out another enemy. And now for those 5 to 10 seconds, it's now 7 on 5, and then maybe even 8 on 4, and then it's suddenly a massive numbers advantage for a couple of seconds. Again, it's either super overpowered or super underpowered, and I can't tell which one because I'm coming up with these myself, and if you can't tell, I'm not a game dev. I'm just coming up with these creatively and trying to fit them to the character as best I can. And lastly, Darkseid. I mean, yeah, Darkseid has to be in this. I'm actually kind of surprised we don't have Thanos in Marvel Rivals yet. But Darkseid would be able to float like Doctor Strange, but of course he has to have like the perfect posture that comes with being Darkseid. He'd be mostly melee, he'd have some range with some weaker Omega Beams, because his ultimate has to be the OP Omega Beam. It is auto-aimed because that's a whole thing that he can like control them while he's firing them. It just deals an insane amount of damage on a few enemies. Again, it has to be balanced. It can't be too broken. Now, I came up with a lot more than just 9 tanks. I actually came up with about 18 tanks. So all of the extra heroes that I thought up will be in the description below. Similarly with the damage dealers or the DPSs or the duelists and the support strategists, healers, if you will. And now it's time for the DPSs or the duelists, if you will. And starting off, we had to get the last member of the Trinity, Batman. And honestly, I could see Batman also being a strategist. He kind of feels like a strategist, somebody who just elevates the abilities of everybody else. But at the same time, I'm like, people are going to want to take out enemies with him. He's got to be a damage dealer, right? So similarly to Moon Knight in terms of his traversal, you'd have the cape for some gliding, and you'd have the grapple gun, which will be great for traversing up to, get high ground or move faster across the floor, kind of like Spider-Man's web when you turn off web assist, but also like Bucky's arm and pull enemies towards you. You'd also have smoke bombs, and of course his left click may be a melee combo and his right click could be for some ranged batarangs. But his ultimate is bringing in either the Batmobile or the Batwing and able to deal damage in a specific area for a short amount of time. Now, the Flash. And I don't care if you think about Barry Allen, I don't care if you think Wally West, I don't care if you think Jay Garrick, but just the Flash. His ult would move like Psylocke's. It was hard to come up with an idea for his ult, but when you think about it, Psylocke's ult is pretty perfect. You're moving very quick in a certain area, but you can't be hit while you're ulting. You can't be targeted. I think within a certain AoE that would be able to be moved around on the map, you could deal a lot of damage and pretty much be a 1-to-1 Psylocke ult. He would have the best ground traversal in the game. So think of like Luna Snow with her ice skates, but just even faster, because he's got to feel like the Flash without being too OP in terms of his traversal. Now we're moving into Aquaman. It was very difficult to try to come up with powers for Aquaman that wasn't exactly Namor or Namor, depending on which way you like to pronounce it. I tend to go back and forth, so bear with me as I maybe pronounce his name both ways. With Aquaman, I thought maybe more focus on his trident with techniques rather than just straight up dropping squids and spamming Namor's trident, in Rivals. Maybe his ults for Aquaman would, instead of being like a whale that comes out like Namor's and splashing causing knockdown, what if it's simply a giant wave that also deals damage but does knock back? So it's more directional rather than just knocking everybody down. Next up, Nightwing. I think would also have great traversal. I think he would have a melee with occasional stuns with his Escrima-sticks, but he'd be able to flip around similar to Star-Lord. And maybe he can flip around more often, or he'd have a faster cooldown to kind of play into his acrobatics. But his ult, I think, would be very similar to Spidey. Very close range, dealing a lot of quick damage, but also stunning anybody within the immediate vicinity with his Escrima-sticks. Next up, Beast Boy. And I think Beast Boy should be like Mr. Fantastic, could become an off-tank temporarily. He would have being able to shapeshift into various animals. And one could be an elephant or a rhino or something where he becomes tank-like for a few seconds. And other ones would be like a lion or a bird for traversal, maybe a tiger. And that would allow him to have various abilities and maybe even change his role slightly throughout the game. But his ultimate, turn into a T-Rex and just stomp all over everybody and be able to like go down and bite people. Maybe at the price of some of your, movement speed. So it's either you can deal in a wide area a lot of damage by just stomping on enemies, or you can be like reaching down and biting people, and it makes you move a little bit slower, which allows you to cover less area, but in that more condensed area, you deal a lot more damage. Next up, Starfire. When coming up with ideas for Starfire, I couldn't help but just think of how Iron Man exists in Rivals. Kind of varying Starfire from Iron Man, maybe she'd have faster rate of fire for her primary that deals a little bit less damage per hit, so it's a little bit more balanced, and her ultimate would pretty much be the same thing, just massive, green plasma energy that just blows up an area. And Green Arrow. I swear this is the last time it's basically a carbon copy of a character. At least I'm trying my best not to carbon copy characters from Marvel Rivals. I know that Oliver Queen and Clinton Barton are extremely different characters in terms of personality and their roles within their teams. But dear God, in terms of just maybe the odd different trick arrow, I could not think of anything that Green Arrow could have that Hawkeye doesn't already have. So maybe he has like an ultimate, like super fast fire for his ultimate. I'm literally spitballing that. I don't have that written down. I am still trying to think of ideas for Green Arrow other than just being a carbon copy Hawkeye. Let's move on to the Joker, because you got to get the Joker in this game. So I think a cool idea is like, think of like Bruce Banner's gamma bomb, his shift ability where you can throw that like explosion of gamma radiation. Imagine that, but Joker toxin, maybe a little bit wider AoE, because Joker is in his main form. It's not Banner in the weak form just trying to survive it before he can become Hulk again. It's Joker all the time. So it's a wider AoE and it's Joker toxin. And maybe like a cool animation thing is like the characters, when they're walking through this, get like creepy smiles. And for his ult, I'm a massive fan of the Death in the Family comic. And so I think a really, really fun thing would be like, he just pulls out a crowbar, and similar to Bucky's or Winter Soldiers from Rivals, it's one target at a time and it's all success based. So the more successful you are with, killing one character and dealing extra damage afterwards, you can then go to another character and another and another and again and again. Again. Sorry. Next up is another kind of duo character, kind of like Shazam and Black Adam, and that is Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Honestly, if you can only pick one, I couldn't tell you which one I'd prefer. Probably Hawkgirl. That's probably just being raised on the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited cartoons. Fun fact, if you watch the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited cartoons and you like the character of Hawkgirl, she was voiced by the mother from Wizards of Waverly Place. Yeah, I found that out when rewatching Justice League and Justice League Unlimited semi-recently, and that I've not been able to shake that thought ever since. But anyway, their abilities. I mean, their melee has to be the nth metal mace. I mean, it has to be. Then I think it'd be really cool to have like a flight to dive like the Human Torch, where like if you press the F as Human Torch, he'll jump down and dive and deal a lot of knockback and damage to area. And I think their ultimate would be like dashing through an area, and then you're doing a bunch of knock-up with their mace, his or her mace. Next up, Catwoman. And I think generally she's going to play similarly to Black Panther. She'll have like her dash and, her whip to control and damage enemies. Her melee, I mean, it has to be just a simple cat scratch, but her ultimate would be jumping around quickly from target to target, dealing a lot of damage in a very specific area. So maybe it's like a specific line, like however many enemies are in a specific line, she can damage them. So you want to have your enemies lined up, maybe on the side of convoy or aside of the payload in convoy or something. And next up, Robin, specifically Damian Wayne Robin. I'm going to tell you right now, I would not be including Red Hood and Tim Drake Red Robin at launch in this roster. And the main reason for that is not to have this entire thing just be Batman characters. Have a few Bat family related characters and introduce more as time goes on. But for right now, Robin would be Damian Wayne. his primary would be his katana. He would have a smaller hitbox similar to Jeff or Rocket Raccoon. And his ultimate, not trying to be too similar to Batman, I would come up with something kind of creative where shooting your grapple gun into somebody and you quickly run around them and you tie them all up. And while he's doing this, he's throwing batarangs in there, slicing with his sword and dealing a lot of damage. Next up, Deathstroke. And with Deathstroke, I think he'd be kind of similar to Black Widow or the Punisher, where like he'll have a sword for primary, melee damage, but he could also swap into like a rifle for some strong like mid-range damage. And then you would also be able to, in your ult, just be like Punisher and mow down enemies. Next up, Black Manta. Simple. I think you should have a harpoon somewhere that can damage and pull targets. And then, his ult has to be the laser eyes. It has to be like, don't overthink it. That's the kind of the motto with this video. With Harley Quinn coming up next, to vary her from the Joker, I think a cool idea with her is to have her use her hammer a lot of times. So for those of us who've played DC Universe Online and did that boss battle against Harley Quinn, you might recall, and when she does an ability where she spins with her hammer, she's immune to CC and just deals a lot of damage, and eventually she's only stopped because she gets dizzy. Now, I'm not saying that she should get dizzy after her ults, but for, a set number of seconds, she spins, she's immune to CC, she deals a lot of damage, windmill into a lot of other opposing teams. Moving into Black Canary. Yeah, this is going to be kind of the pure melee Iron Fist type character. But again, when it comes to the ults, do not overthink it. The Canary Cry is right there. Devastating damage in a cone direction right in front of her. Next up, John Constantine. And let me tell you, this was probably the most difficult character to come up with abilities for. I think I came up with an idea that was pretty unique. So let me know what you think about his abilities in the comments below, because I feel like I did a pretty cool job of coming up with something unique, but it might not be what everybody expects. So I think a cool thing for him is to have invisibility with like traps and maybe like autonomous magic turrets. His primary would be similar to Human Torch's, though instead of like fire, it's just through magic, where it's like a short range kind of shotgun type blast of magic. But his ult is a portal in the ground that starts out as a pentagram that opens up from the center outwards. And in this portal is a demon-infested dimension. Enemies are caught in this portal and they don't have a way of like flying out or jumping out. They just fall in and instantly die. But it opens up relatively slowly. There's a little bit of a warning, so it's not just like, boop, everyone's dead. At the very least, this helps hold off a choke point, a large choke point, for a few seconds. Maybe if you're waiting for your team to come back in, it could be pretty nice to hold off that point for a little while. And next up, the Red Tornado. And I think he'll be generally similar to Storm, though I think a cool thing with him having his aerokinesis, if you will, where like with Hawkeye, you'd be able to you're able to deflect abilities and attacks from your enemies. To do that with Red Tornado as well, with just a simple like air swipe to the side, you can like knock opposing enemies attacks out of the air and protect yourself. But for his ultimate, instead of Storm, where it's just like you take over a tornado and you move it through an area, having more like Johnny Storms where you're just making a ton of vortexes and a bunch of tornadoes. Because I always see Red Tornado as flying with having like a vortex already kind of underneath him. I think this would just be a really cool way to just have a ton of tornadoes on the battlefield. And lastly, Static Shock. He would be flying around on a static saucers. I think he would be able to create lightning shields, and his primary would be charged for more damage. So he would be, he'd be a DPS that would be able to create shields and block for teammates, which I think would be really, really cool. But his ultimate is where he would deal a massive lightning bolt that would chain between a bunch of enemies and just deal a ton of damage. If there's very few enemies, it is a ton of damage and likely would kill 1 or 2 enemies like that. Whereas if it's like 4 or 5 or 6 enemies, it's a good chunk of damage, but you're not really going to be killing anybody. Those are my DPS, my damage dealers, my duelists. The overflow of other characters I thought up for duelists would be in the description below. And now it's time for the supports. And I have to admit, this was the most difficult roster to think up, is what would the supports be. A couple of these make perfect sense, but I had to get really creative with the roster, which characters are here and how their abilities work. I did the best I could. So if there's any ideas for support characters in DC Comics that I didn't use here, leave them in the comments below, because I had a lot of trouble coming up with support characters. Again, kind of going in no particular order, we're going to start with Martian Manhunter. And I think he'd be kind of similar to Mantis and Loki, where his ult would be shapeshifting, very similar to Loki, but he would also be able to phase and shield himself, quote unquote, temporarily, where he'd be able to walk through select walls. And then he would just be able to buff teammates with his telepathy, similar to Mantis. Next up is Raven. And I think Raven generally would play kind of similar to Adam Warlock. I mean, one thing, it's more of a minor thing, but when she ults, she has to say the classic Azarath Metrion Zinthos. She has to. And then her ult maybe could be her soul self, the literal giant Raven. That is a projectile that heals teammates and or damages enemies when you become this Raven and fly through, you know, this area 1 or 2 or 3 times or whatever, what have you. And then I think she would have a soul bond like ability that is just themed around her empathy rather than souls with Adam Warlock. Next up, Dr. Fate. And I think Dr. Fate, think of like Moon Knight in Rivals, but as a healer. So you can throw onks at the ground, similar to what Moon Knight does, because both their characters deal with onks. But you'd be able to use that to heal all the teammates in the area rather than deal damage to all the enemies. You'd have an ult wipe that would be like Jeff. So imagine, instead of Jeff, where you have this giant radius where he can just, you know, eat all of his opponents and spit out his teammates and then jump and, you know, jump off the map and such. But with Fates, you would have a cone in front of you that would suck up all of your enemies into your Ankh prison, and where you could do a similar thing. Next up, Zatanna Zatara. And obviously very similar character to John Constantine in the comics, but I think here she'd be a really interesting support where her quote-unquote antipathy is where you can redirect trauma that's directed onto you and to somebody else. So it'd be kind of like Reed Richards' shift ability, where she becomes invulnerable for a little while and then can redirect that damage out to an opponent. But also her ult would be giving all allies in the immediate vicinity of her massive healing over time and or overshield. It wouldn't be like Mantis's ult, because this is very similar to Mantis's ult where she can heal and give overshield, but instead it's maybe a little bit more powerful, but it only affects the teammates that are directly next to Zatanna. So like if you're playing as Zatanna, it's a gather to me, I'm about to ult, everyone get health and overshield and go and, you know, kill the opposing team. Where Mantis, it's over time and you have to you have that area underneath you. So Zatanna, it's a bit more powerful, but it's only a one-time boom, it's gone. Next up, the Doctor from the Authority. And so this is going to be the primary healer for any comp. This will kind of be your Dagger or your Luna Snow. It's just going to be a ton of magical healing through the primary, and the res is going to be, the ultimate will be a res, similar to Adam Warlock. The Doctor is just going to be your classic general healer. Next up is the character that was the most difficult to place. So I literally just said, okay, I can think of him how he could work as a tank, I can think how he'd work as a duelist, I can think of how he could work as a support. So I'm just going to save this character for what role I have the most trouble filling, which of course was support. So this is how I would do the Green Lantern as a support. You'd be able to create constructs that could either damage enemies or protect his allies. The constructs would also be able to crowd control and provide healing, but his ultimate would be similar to Cloak and Daggers, where Cloak and Dagger can paint the ground with their ultimate by dashing over that area. Green Lantern would simply fly up similar to Hela, but pull out the ring and absolutely splatoon the shit out of a point to prevent overpowered ultimates. The further you are from your origin, once you start firing, you have to keep firing, and the further out you go, the harder it is to move and the slower you move. So it de-incentivizes maxing out your sensitivity and just wailing your mouse back and forth and just paint the entire map. Next up, Mr. Terrific. And I think he'd be similar to, again, Adam Warlock, I've said that a lot, but also Rocket Raccoon. His passive is where he cannot be targeted by auto-aim mechanics, and that's from his mask. In the comics, this mask has him be capable of not being targeted by these sort of auto-aim mechanic abilities. Like when Brother Eye tried to take over the world, he couldn't target Mr. Terrific because of the mask. Then the ultimate would be the T-Spheres. That's what those things are called that you see in the Superman trailer when Superman's working with Mr. Terrific. They would be used to shield areas and heal allies. And so his ult is using those to shield massive areas and heal all your allies. So think of like, instead of invisibility with invisible one's ult, it's just a bunch of these T-spheres providing a massive shield. Next up, the penultimate support character, Poison Ivy. I think with her vines, she should get some sort of crowd control. I think she'd have flowers to be able to, she'll be able to throw on the ground or on teammates. That would also provide short-ranged AoE healing. But her ult is where she puts down a giant flower that blooms gloriously over a certain area that does massive healing over time to any teammates that are near it, and massive damage over time to enemies that come near it. So it's kind of like Cloak and Daggers, where it's dealing damage and healing depending on whether you're on that team with the flower or not. And lastly, Brother Blood. Possibly a life drain type mechanic, not anti-heal, life drain, where think of like Luna Snow's Snowflake or E ability, where she can like say to an ally, you, whatever healing I do to any of these other heroes, you will receive some of that healing as well. Think of that, but instead, Brother Blood, whatever damage he deals to an enemy, that ally actually gets healing done equal to or set some ratio as the damage that he's dealing out. And maybe even vice versa. If he targets a single enemy and heals a teammate, that enemy will also take damage. The ultimate would be him sending his cult followers, which would be NPCs, of course, and they would heal allies and damage enemies that are directly near Brother Blood. And there you have it. That is what I would do for a DC-themed hero shooter, as somebody who has no experience making games, is just a big nerd on the internet. So let me know what you thought of these ideas down in the comments below, and what you would do for a DC-themed hero shooter. And if you didn't like this video, and you did, the button's right down there. But also, if you did like this content, made it to the end of the video, you likely will like what kind of content I make. So I'd recommend pressing that subscribe button, as I do plan to make a lot more of these videos in the future. And if you are interested in checking out another video by me, there's going to be 1 or 2 on screen here to check that out. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.